Well, good morning. I want to begin as our prayer the first verse of hymn 82, not only because it's the greatest hymn in the hymnal, but also because the first verse, I think, is appropriate. So, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Of the Father's love begotten, ere the worlds began to be, he is Alpha and Omega. He, the source, the ending, he. Of the things that are, of the things that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore. Amen. That simply encapsulates everything that before anything was, God out of love created everything that is. And Jesus is the incarnate Word who was the agent by which all of that happened. In the past, in the present, in the future. Everything is held fast in that love. So, what I want to do this morning, and we'll just see how it goes, I want to talk about the call of God. I want to talk about the saints of God. And then I want to talk about trust in God as we look at so we'll say from 1985 to 1998. The call of God. The first time I ever went to Jerusalem, I think it was 1984, I did not know at that time. I naively asked a Palestinian Christian in Jerusalem, how long has your family been Christian? And he paused for a minute and then he said, well, we're not quite sure, but we think Pentecost. It was a wonderful reminder to sort of a white American that in fact we're the ones that had the gospel good news brought to us, but that indigenous Palestinian Christians have been Christian way, way back. I say that because I've shared Violette Mubarak, the executive director of the Princess Basma Center, has shared that she fears that her generation will be the last generation of Palestinian Christians, that indigenous Christians simply cannot survive anymore in that environment. Now, the way that I first went to Jerusalem was the dean of St. George's College at the time was a man by the name of John Peterson, who I met in 1984, and you may remember has been sort of our guide in our pilgrimages. So, as we look back, I want to look forward, and by the way, John is going to come to my last Sunday, which I'm really, very thrilled that he would do that. But I just want to say that one of the things that I think is true is that we have been blessed that the Anglican Communion has come to us. We've been able to participate in the life of the larger church all of these years. And it's just come because we've been open to listening to the call of God. And so, the reason we have ministry in Tanzania is because we had a seminarian from Tanzania while studying at Virginia Seminary. And that was a logical connection. The way that we have ministry in Honduras, which, remember, is part of the Episcopal Church. Remember, the Episcopal Church is not a national church. We're larger than the borders of the United States. But that's because the Reverend Robin Dodge, who was our associate, was ordained through the Diocese of Honduras. So that's a logical connection. I've had the pleasure and privilege of serving on the board of the Compass Rose Society, which is engaged with trying to keep the Anglican Communion whole and vital. Our own Reverend Dr. Kate Sonderegger is busy, hard at work, trying to help the Anglican Communion theologically sort out its differences. So, as we look back, I just also want to kind of remind us as we go forward that I hope that relationship with the larger church will always be a piece of our identity, because I think we're healthier. And I want to go straight to that point. My call to St. Mary's was really pretty clear. Um, I had this rumble of call. Little did I know that part of it goes back to my infancy, because my dad, who was the rector of Grace Church in Alexandria, and George Tittman, who was the rector of St. Mary's, were very, very close friends. Now remember that there was a day school where the parking lot is, and where Rixey View townhouses are was all St. Mary's land. So George Tittman left in the late 1950s, but in the early 1950s, he called my dad up in the middle of the night and said, "Will you come administer last rites to our infant son, whom the doctor has said will not survive the night?" And halfway through praying last rites, my dad began to pray for the child's recovery. And George was so unhappy with him because he and his wife had kind of prepared themselves for the death of their child. And my dad said, "George, if the Holy Spirit tells you to pray for healing, I don't know what else I'm supposed to do." Well, the child recovered. And I grew up with that little snippet of St. Mary's. Now remember, if you live in Alexandria, you never come to Arlington. Why would you do that? That was that. Then George Tittman left. Then remember, St. Mary's went through a very difficult time. St. Peter's came into being by people who left St. Mary's about 1960. And from 1960 until 1985, when I came, there was a full quarter century of sort of corporate depression and problems. The rector who was here was also the headmaster of the school, but things continued to decline. Finally, he left in the late 1960s. In 1971, my youth group in Alexandria went to St. Paul's Mount Lebanon in Pittsburgh to sing a folk mass, because that's what you did in those days. When I was a senior in high school, the man who'd been the assistant at St. Paul's in Mount Lebanon came and was the rector of St. Mary's, Paul Bankston. Unfortunately, Father Bankston died within a couple of years of melanoma. So at that point, the parish was very, very small, very fractured, and then they had this additional piece of grief on top of it. His successor, my predecessor, wonderful, faithful priest of the church, who was, however, on all the losing side of the issues that were decided in the 1970s and 80s in the Episcopal Church. So, change from the 1928 prayer book to the 1979 prayer book was a huge issue for this congregation. The ordination of women was a huge issue for this congregation. The continued, shall we say, liberal social justice stance on the part of this congregation of the Episcopal Church was a hard issue for this congregation during that time. So I only half-jokingly say that when I arrived, I said to people, "I know what your evangelism cry is. It's come be mad with us." And, you know, they were mad at the diocese all the way back to the late 50s because the bishop didn't intervene the way they thought. And then they were unhappy because the bishop of the diocese at that time wrote a not helpful letter in which he said, quote unquote, "Due to Father Eads' tender conscience, I will allow you to continue using the 1928 prayer book until the new rector arrives." Well, that just infuriated people because everybody loved the 1928 prayer book. So it wasn't just Father Ead in that regard. When I told the Bishop Suffragan of Virginia, I was serving at Christ Church in Old Town Alexandria, that I thought God was calling me to St. Mary's. So I can't remember if I finished my statement. So when I was a senior in high school, we sang a folk mass here. So I came to St. Mary's then. Otherwise, the only reason you came to Arlington was to play putt-putt golf and go to Gifford's ice cream store. Little did I know that I would live my life in Arlington, and I've loved every minute of it. It's a great place to live. Those Alexandria people need to understand they're not a bit better than we Arlingtonians are. So Bishop Lewis came through Christ Church. I said, "Bishop," I have this rumble of call to go to St. Mary's Arlington, and his word-for-word quote to me was, "You're too young, they have too many problems, and I like you too much to throw you in that alligator-infested swamp." So you can see that things were at kind of a low ebb. But we persevered, and I don't have time to go through the whole song and dance. It was a wild journey. But I finally got to interview with the search committee, and the very first question that was put to me by, God rest her soul, Elsbeth Delavar, the very first question was, "Well, if you came, would you fire the organist?" And I had the presence of mind to say, "Well, don't you think I ought to meet him first?" You know? So it was like, okay, here we go. Now, I've told this story over again, but it is kind of wonderful that when the bishop said you have to move to the 1979 prayer book, the entire search committee quit en masse. They not only quit the search committee, they quit St. Mary's, they quit the Episcopal Church. And so there weren't very many people here. So the senior warden, wonderful, that's why the second category is the Saints of God, Admiral Kuntz, went to Bud Gilligan, an active duty Air Force colonel, and said, "Colonel Gilligan," and Admiral Kuntz always talked this way to everybody. He's the only person that's called me 2/3 of the Trinity in one breath. You know, one day he went, "Now listen, Father Merrill, I just need you to understand it. And furthermore, son, you better do what I say, you understand?" That's just the way he did with everybody. So that's how you knew you were in Admiral Kuntz's good graces. So he went to Bud Gilligan and said, "Colonel Gilligan, I need you to chair the search committee for the new rector." And Bud said that he responded and said, well, Admiral Kuntz, there's just kind of one problem with that. "What's that? What's the problem with that, Colonel?" I said, "Well, I'm actually a Roman Catholic." So I don't know how I can chair an Episcopal search committee. "Colonel, shut up and do your job. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, Admiral." So a Roman Catholic actually chaired the search committee that recommended me to the vestry. And I won't belabor this, but it is so funny. So I'm all of 30 years old. The youngest person on the vestry is in their late 60s. 70s and 80s from there, and they're all smoking cigarettes. My eyes are burning and watering. It was awful. Finally, we did not want to deal with the passing of the peace, and so I finessed it one way and I finessed it another way. But when it came up the third time, 2 hours into the interview, I kind of lost it, and I just said, "You know what? Don't call me as your rector. I'll be miserable. You'll be miserable. Let's forget the whole thing." And that's the way the meeting ended. And I walked out not very happy. And the next morning, the phone rang, and "We've unanimously elected you as our new rector." So don't tell me that call is not the essential piece. God speaks. The question is whether we will listen, especially when God calls us into those places that on the face of things don't look all that inviting. "You really want me to take up my cross and go there?" All of that to say, I was absolutely clear that God had called me here, and I was more than willing to see what's what. Now, I read this to the vestry every year, but for those of you who haven't yet had the privilege, and Andy, you can come up anytime, you know that. You have certain rights. Yes, you do. It's a really important story because this is the St. Mary's that I inherited. People who love their parish, love God, but I would argue that they got things reversed. They loved their parish. They loved their prayer book and the Episcopal Church. They loved God. Remember, it's supposed to be the other way around. We love God. We like being Episcopalians, but finally, that's not the be-all, end-all. And our parish, yeah, we love our parish. We want to work, but it has to be the other direction, or you get yourself into trouble, it seems to me. So this is very short. It's a wonderful parable written by Canon Theodore Waddell, who was at Washington Cathedral, written many, many years ago. On a dangerous seacoast where shipwrecks often occur, there was once a crude little life-saving station. The building was just a hut, and there was only one boat, but the few devoted members kept a constant watch over the sea, and with no thought of themselves went out day and night, tirelessly searching for the lost. Many lives were saved by this wonderful little station so that it became famous. Some of those who were saved and various others in the surrounding area wanted to become associated with the station and give of their time and money and effort for the support of its work. New boats were bought and new crews trained. The little life-saving station grew. Some of the members of the life-saving station were unhappy that the building was so crude and poorly equipped. They felt that a more comfortable place should be provided as the first refuge of those saved from the sea. So they replaced the emergency cots with beds and put better furniture in the enlarged building. Now the life-saving station became a popular gathering place for its members, and they decorated it beautifully and furnished it exquisitely because they used it as a sort of club. Fewer members were now interested in going to sea on life-saving missions, so they hired lifeboat crews to do this work. The life-saving motif still prevailed in this club's decoration, and there was a liturgical lifeboat in the room where the club initiations were held. About this time, a large ship was wrecked off the coast, and the hired crews brought in boatloads of cold, wet, and half-drowned people. They were dirty and sick, and some of them had black skin and some had yellow skin. The beautiful new club was in chaos. So the property committee immediately had a shower house built outside the club where victims of shipwreck could be cleaned up before coming inside. At the next meeting, there was a split in the club membership. Most of the members wanted to stop the club's life-saving activities as being unpleasant and a hindrance to the normal social life of the club. Some members insisted upon life-saving as their primary purpose and pointed out that they were still called a life-saving station. But they were finally voted down and told that if they wanted to save the lives of all the various kinds of people who were shipwrecked in those waters, they could begin their own life-saving station down the coast. They did. As the years went by, the new station experienced the same changes that had occurred in the old. It evolved into a club, and yet another life-saving station was founded. History continued to repeat itself, and if you visit that seacoast today, you will find a number of exclusive clubs along that shore. Shipwrecks are frequent in those waters, but most of the people drowned. That is a cautionary tale for the church, because churches are prone to becoming clubs. And that is not the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is to be a life-saving station, not just for its members, but especially for those outside of these walls. So, a couple of funny stories from the start, and then I can move into the saints of this church with this. When I first got here, I came in March. So my first vestry meeting was in April, and so that's a third of the way through the fiscal year, and they finally had a budget, and we were already in April. They were finally able to put together a budget. So the treasurer was able to make his January report, and I happened to notice that for hospitality for the entire year, $750 was allocated. And I noticed that in January, $586 had been spent against his $750 annual number. So I naively thought to myself, oh, well, they've bought cups and coffee and got everything ready for hospitality for the year, all the supplies. And so I asked, gosh, $586 in the first month of the fiscal year, that's a large expenditure. Can somebody tell me what that went for? Well, there was dead silence around the vestry table. I mean, dead silence. I mean, like we sat for 45 seconds probably in dead silence. You know how agonist that is. I mean, you just want to jump out of your skin. And I kept saying, but you know what? Somebody's going to crack before I do. And so we sat, and finally someone cleared their throat and said, well, oh, and I'm sorry, I need to back up. And it's good that Jonathan is here, because Jonathan was about when Lindsay, it's good Lindsay is here in that regard too, because Jonathan and Lindsay were two of perhaps, I don't know, 6 or 8 children in the church school total. And finally someone cleared their throat and said, oh, well, we wanted to thank teachers for teaching in the church school this year. So we took teachers and their spouses and vestry members and their spouses out to dinner at Evans Farm Inn. And that was the bill for the meal. Well, I instinctively came up out of my chair and said, that's all the money we have for the year? And you spend it on yourselves? Is that what you're telling me? Well, the superintendent of the church school resigned the next day, and in walked Margaret. Carolyn, stand up on behalf of your mom. In walked Claudia Boswell, who ran the church school for the next 30 years. I mean, the saints of God are everywhere, and this parish is chock-a-block full of them. So I want to back up just a little more, because my very first Sunday, there was a group of people who had prayed for St. Mary's during the times that were very, very difficult. And so I wanted to join them in their prayer. And it was the most wonderful group, because remember the church faced the other direction at that time. But they would sit in semi-darkness for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whenever the Spirit decided to move people. One would get up, almost like a herd of cows. We were just chewing our cud, just praying and being in the presence of God. And then somebody would get up and walk, and slowly each person would get up and walk right behind them. And then they would sit and they would just discuss, what do you think God is doing here? Now, on the one hand, that's not productive ministry. That doesn't make any widgets. That doesn't increase our numbers. That doesn't do all the measurements that we want to do. I would submit to you that without those people faithfully praying, week in and week out, when there didn't seem to be much of a future for us, I think that was absolutely instrumental in God turning the ship around, as it were. So that's just sort of one example in that regard. I've told lots of you wonderful stories about Steve Bedwell, who is the one who navigated the sale of the land and establishing the St. Mary's Foundation. Steve was one of these wonderful people. I believe he was a first-name basis friend with President Kennedy. So he moved in those kind of circles, but was just so wonderfully accessible. The very first week I was here, you're young and you got to do all this stuff. There are all these issues. I'm going to get on it. And I saw this old guy walk down the, hallway, and I thought, no, get up. I put my coat on. I went, brought him in. Smartest thing I ever did, because I wouldn't have been here if it weren't for Steve Bedwell. Because I'll tell you that story in half a second. But the first time I ever met him, he said to me, Father Merrill, go pick up the phone on your desk. I said, what? He said, go pick up the phone. So I picked up the phone on my desk, and he said, look at it. So I looked at it, and he said, what do you see? And I said, Steve, I see a phone. What are you talking about? He said, no, look a little more closely. Look how few holes there are for listening and how many there are for talking. Just remember that your parishioners are constructed that way, and you'll do just fine. I was like, oh, okay. Steve, I also laughed because when he had heart valve replacement surgery, I went out to Fairfax Hospital the night before his surgery. He's staring out the window. And so I said to him, Steve, what are you looking at? He said, I'm not looking at anything. He said, what I'm really pondering, though, is it a good thing or a bad thing that my surgeon and my priest are both under 40? And I said, Well, I think it's a good thing. But the very first annual meeting I had, we had bought the 1982 hymnals. And at that meeting, someone stood up and said, I want to take a vote to go back to the 1940 hymnal. And again, we don't have any money. So, and the man who suggested this is one of the real lovely saints of God, a wonderful, wonderful guy. So I said to him, I said, well, you know, I love the 1940 hymnal. I was raised on the 1940 hymnal. However, the church's hymnal is now the 1982 hymnal, and we don't have any money. I mean, we've spent an awful lot of money to make this happen, so we're not going back. But even more so, you need to understand the canons of the church are such that the rector ultimately makes decisions around liturgy. That's just the way the Episcopal Church is structured. Again, a very long, uncomfortable silence. And Steve Bedwell stood up and he said, you know, I think Father Merrill's doing what he thinks best for our long-term health, and I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt. And with that, everybody was like, if Steve says it's okay, we're done. So remember that all of us are called to stand tall at times in our lives, whether it's within this community of faith or whether it's in our workplace. I'd argue that what church is supposed to do is to get us powered up on Sundays. We're fed, right? In the sacrament. We're fed in God's word. We're fed in the love of the people of God. We're ready to go, and we go back out into the world so that when you have to stand up and make a difficult decision, when you have to make an unpopular decision, when you're willing to say, no, I'm sorry, that's not appropriate. We live in times when you sort of have to decide, where am I going to stand up and be counted? And I think if we don't, we run real risk of simply becoming a club, and we come here, it's a little respite from out there, and oh, isn't that nice, and I like these people. I don't like her much, but that's all right, I like all these people over here. You know, everything's fine. So instead, it's this idea of, no, that's right. I'm reminded that I am empowered by my baptism to go and proclaim the good news that God's love is for everybody, everywhere. And I'm not going to stand for anything less than that, even if it costs me to try and do it. Now, next, this church was totally inaccessible for handicapped persons, anybody in a wheelchair. One of the first things I did was wonderful John Atkinson. I would help wheel him up every Sunday because I was the youngest person around here except for Margaret and Carolyn. We would do that, and so we realized Gordon Ockenrider, God bless him. Remember, his wife Betty just died last year. Two of the saints of God of this parish. Gordon was a junior warden, and he went and researched, and we thought we were going to put a ramp in, and he came back and said, you know, everyone said the only viable long-term answer is an elevator. And the vestry, I'm jumping ahead now to trusting in God. Remember, we don't have any money. All right, in 1985, the pledged income was $56,400. I took a huge pay cut to come as the rector from being the assistant at Christ Church because there was no money. So I wanted to come, you come. But for us to step out and say, if that's the right long-term answer, we're going to trust and make it happen. And I am so proud of this congregation because that's exactly what we did. And lo and behold, now, all these years later, we're accessible to everybody. I mean, it's great to say you want to be an inclusive congregation, but that really means you've got to try to find ways that any child of God is welcome in this space. And we're going to ensure that that happens. Then, wonderful man, Scott Goff, Scott and Lori, he walked over to me one day and said, you know what? That house right there is on the market. If the church doesn't buy that house, it will be bundled with those other properties, and eventually townhouses will be built right there. And if the church ever wants to be able to expand into the future, future generations of St. Mary's won't have that opportunity if we don't get a spike to make that happen. So we had a special meeting of the parish. I said, don't vote for this unless you vote with your pocketbook. and we need $40,000 for a down payment. And 2 weeks later, we came up with $40,000. And it came from a wide range of people. But you also ought to know, and David, you can stand up just for a second because you are the senior trustee of St. Mary's, so that's not shabby. David went over and guaranteed that the house wouldn't be sold out from under us on his own. And lo and behold, we got that house. And as you know, we own these 3 houses as well. Precisely, they act now wonderfully, sort of affordable housing, but we don't know what God's going to do 20 years, 40 years from now, but at least future generations will have the opportunity because people stood up in their day to do what needed to be done. That's never changes. It's always in season. What is God calling us to do? Well, God's provided lots of saints of God who've stood tall in the past. I look out on this room, there are lots and lots of wonderful saints of God who will lead us into the next chapter of our history. So that takes us up to the fact, remember there's an old adage, it's absolutely true. Prosper, I'm glad you're here too, because Prosper gets this better than anybody else does, and that is that maintenance deferred becomes capital expenditure. This parish hadn't done anything. Remember, you had 25 years of kind of depressed times. This parish building was in terrible shape. And the parish made the decision, we've got to step up and do a capital campaign and get this parish righted. Again, I'll go back to Jonathan or Lindsay or Carolyn or Margaret, or a number of you have been here for a long, long time. But, you know, remember it was that awful brown asbestos tile downstairs? The nursery was so dark and dank, I don't think anybody would have put their kid in there, except Jonathan, I had to. So I mean, it was just, and again, people stood up and said, yes, we'll go for it. Also, I actually was sharing this last night with my family, but David and I went and made the first call I'd ever made in a capital campaign. And 2 things. One is that Jane Shaffron's dad, George Shaffron, another wonderful saint of God of this parish, once said to me, I was talking about what do I do about asking people for a bunch of money. And he said, well, just remember this. You make your ask, and then the next person who speaks loses. So you put the number out there and just wait. It seems like I do a lot of waiting on things. I'm beginning to see. But David went with me. Well, I did the first time I ever did this. And we walked out, and I said, and it was to George and Bonnie Bogomil. Again, wonderful, wonderful giants. And I made the ask, and it was successful, by the way. But I walked back out, and I said to David, I said, you know, I thought I sounded so calm, cool, and collected, but then when I asked for the actual dollar amount, I felt like my voice went up an octave. And David, being David, said, no, your voice didn't go up an octave, it went up 2. So, again, the willingness to do what needs to be done. But that obviously means you have to discern what it is that needs to be done. It also means that the Holy Spirit's voice is not the only voice that whispers in our ear what we think should be done. So the whole issue of discernment, the whole issue of being saturated in prayer so that when it gets clear, we can act is kind of, I hope, a piece of who we are that we will continue right on through. We made the decision to build a good pipe organ. And then goodbye, Andy. Then Ray Glover, who was the general editor of the 1982 hymnal, He and his wife Joyce were parishioners here for a number of years. Ray taught liturgy and music at the seminary, and we were wrestling with what to do. And he came into the vestry and said, I'll never forget, he had two colored blocks, a little blue block and a little red block. And he said, you know, the nave looks like this. And, you know, our organ is now, well, the organ, you may not, no reason why you would know. The organ was up above the loft, and then, as the organ builder said, sound doesn't work that way. You can't put an instrument in a room different in which the room is the organ is supposed to sound, much less have it come out, have to go down, and all the length of the nave. It was hard that I would have to be a half a beat slow singing, because otherwise, by the time the sound already came, anyhow. So Ray came with these little blocks, and he said, you know what? All you have to do is move this block over here, put the altar here, put the organ there. Well, the idea of reversing the interior of the church, remember, people will be very happy to let you preach heresy, just don't move my pew, you know, you know, nobody objected. It was remarkable because it was the right thing to do. And so I think you would agree that the sound that our organ produces is to the glory of God. And, you know, people stepped up to make that happen. All right, we got 5 minutes. Let me stop for a second. And I mean, I just keep going from one thing to the next. But what's on people's minds? Or was it Peggy?
Can you talk some about the money then that went to Rank Cathedral and that, you know, and the outreach money that was also part of the effort?
Yes, and I need to back up because I missed a basic thing. My dad was an Episcopal priest, and somewhere along the line I absorbed the idea that a church that lives unto itself dies unto itself. So because we were so flat broke when I came, I can convince the vestry to tithe to outreach ministry, because 10% of nothing is nothing. And so nobody balked at the dollar figure, but once the percentage is in place, then as the budget grew, you could begin to do some different kinds of things. So that's why, obviously, I hope that that will continue. 11% to the diocese, 14% to outreach. But part of what that really enables us to do is to begin to make systemic change in our own little way. And you all should be really proud, because this parish has done a lot in terms of making a significant contribution, not only to our immediate community, but help to build a cathedral in Rank, help to build a whole church in Tanzania, actually 2 churches, Santa Maria, we'll get to that at some point. Yes, so Russ Randall, I don't know where Russ is, but he was on the altar at 8 o'clock. Russ Randall has long been a leading advocate for South Sudan in the Diocese of Virginia, and he came to me and said, would St. Mary's like to have a Sudanese bishop speak to St. Mary's? And I said, well, yes, of course, that would be lovely. So Daniel Dengbol, who later became the Archbishop of Sudan, was right in this space on on the evening of September 10th, 2001. And someone asked him, shouldn't Muslims and Christians work together? And I'll never forget his saying, well, absolutely. And in fact, I have very good relations with my Muslim neighbors, but I don't think you understand what we're up against. And the next morning was 9/11. And so it wasn't too hard for this parish to put 2 and 2 together that maybe God is calling us to stand fast with Christians in South Sudan as well. You should also know Elizabeth Sheehy, and just a wonderful parishioner, and I'm doing this because she's not very tall. But, you know, it takes a little while for the Red Cross to gear up. Well, that didn't stop Elizabeth. She went right down on 9/11, right through the tape at the Pentagon to first responders to figure out what they needed. She came back and said, you all, they need, believe it or not, they need socks. That's what they're really desperate for. They need playing cards, believe it or not, because they said that we need, at some point, you have to decompress. So we all went out to the CVS and got everything we could. She went right back down the next day and took it all. And so in many ways, St. Mary's was a first responder on 9/11 of the first order. The other way we were a first responder is that Jamie Leonard, now a priest of the Episcopal Church serving in Montana, obviously all the kids were out of school on 9/11, so she got all the kids here in this space, and they made this huge banner that said, "The Children of St. Mary's thank you," and she took it down to the Pentagon. The two things that were wonderful, I'm a great believer that, William Temple is right. I can't explain coincidence, but what I do know is that when I stop praying, coincidences stop happening. Two wonderful things. One was that her parents at that time lived in Atlanta, and there was a local TV crew there, and they just happened to get the Children of St. Mary's thank you. So Jamie's mom called and said, isn't the name of the church that you go to called St. Mary's? And she said, well, yes, not knowing that Jamie was the one who came up with the whole thing. And my classmate and friend had been called up as a reservist to go make death notifications. And he said he came up out of the still smoldering Pentagon after the toughest day of ministry he'd ever had to do. And he saw that banner, and he knew that I was the rector of St. Mary's, and he said, that was the moment that I knew God was in the midst of all this. So, you just don't know how God uses us. All we have to do is make ourselves available and not just show up, but prayerfully. I mean, that's why you're supposed to say your prayers. Okay, I got to quit. All right, listen. Remember that Anglican spirituality is based on the understanding that you come on Sunday. Hopefully the sermon's not boring, but if it is, that's okay. You get fed, you get empowered every Sunday. But Monday through Saturday, you're supposed to start with morning prayer and evening prayer. Don't have to use the prayer book version, but you need to start the day by saying, okay, God, thank you for another day of life. I entrust this day into your care. And at the end of the day, you say your prayers and say, thank you, God, and please forgive me for where I did X or lost my temper here or what have you. And then you come back on Sunday after the world beats you up for 6 days, and oh, that's right, I'm a beloved child of God. I'm not a useless worker that can be expended. I'm somebody because God says I'm somebody. Then you get fed, then you go back out, and then you come back, and then you go out, and you come back. So don't lose that rhythm, because that is the rhythm that sustains us and empowers us. All right, we're done. Thank you all.